Okay, welcome to this live BIMCO webinar on how EU ship recycling rules affect international shipping. We will discuss the latest list over EU-approved ship recycling yards and discuss how to manage the inventory of hazardous materials as required by the EU regulation, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The webinar will last around 45 minutes, and I'll try to include as many questions from you, the audience, as possible. So I invite you to write any questions you may have on these issues during the webinar in the chat box on the right side of your screen, and I'll raise the questions to our expert panel. An important part of the new EU regulation on ship recycling will enter into force on the 31st of December this year, so in 3 months from now. The regulation requires all ships of 500 gross tonnage and above to have an inventory of hazardous materials, also known as the IHM, regardless of the flag they're flying when calling a port or anchorage of a country within the EU. The problem is that COVID-19 has made it difficult for ship owners to develop inventories for the ships and comply with the new regulation in a timely manner. We will in this webinar discuss how ship owners should handle the situation and what has been done from the industry side. Furthermore, since 1st of January 2019, all EU flag ships must be recycled at an approved recycling yard included on the EU list. The current version of the list includes less than 40 yards, and the upcoming version is not expected to significantly increase capacity of the yards. In 2019, BIMCO and MARProof identified that only 9 out of 26 recycling yards approved at that time had physical capacity to recycle large ships. We will take a look at the EU list and whether the ship recycling yards on the list is sufficient to meet the demand from EU flagged ships. With us today to answer these questions, we have 3 leading experts with great insight into the ship recycling regulation, and I'm pleased to introduce our 3 experts. The first expert is Mr. Henning Gramann, Director of Green Ship Recycling Services, a leading global service provider to the entire ship recycling industry. The second expert is Mr. Robin Townsend, partner of MARProof Environmental, a marine consultancy firm specialized in ship recycling legislation and the author of the 2019 study on the EU list of ship recycling facilities. And finally, our third expert is Mr. Aaron Sørensen, head of the marine environment team here at BIMCO. Aaron has, like Henning and Robin, been involved with the development of ship recycling regulation since the dawn of the Hong Kong Convention. We will start with the 3 short presentations from each of the experts in the panel, and then we'll move on to questions and a hopeful lively debate. So please fill in your questions in the chat box during the webinar. Firstly, I'll let Henning give us an update on the implementation of the IHM. Henning, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I looked into the compliance status and where the industry is at the moment. So on the next slide, we can see some issues which have affected the IHM activities globally in 2020. 2020 is definitely the key year for IHM compliance because by the end of this year, the deadline applies for EU visiting ships and all EU flagged ships above 500 gross tons. But the pandemic caused some difficulties with regards to travels, international but also national travels, access to ports, access to the ships. Sometimes the crew said we don't want to have any foreign expert here on board because of the risk to catch corona. It started already in February in China, where we have roughly 45% of all our IHM contracts. In the meantime, we managed all of them, but it had a big impact, especially till May. But globally, the pandemic is returning and increasing, which means we will face further problems. So with regards to the deadline on the 31st of December, it is not clear whether or not it will be postponed or how the enforcement will look like. So it's expected now in October that the EU Parliament will discuss this, and then we need to see what is going to happen. At the moment, we don't have any experience with port state control in regards to IHMs and IHM maintenance. So the next slide shows some of the not widely available data on how much the industry is prepared. So the mid of September, there was a webinar where including a poll, and 19% said, yes, we have completed the IHM development and certification process for our ships. 25% said they are in the progress. Nobody knows where in the process they are. 15% they only have contracted the IHM services, and 41% have not started at all. That makes a total of 56%. Estimated 35,000 ships will be affected by EU SRR, which means just below 20,000 ships will probably not be compliant by the end of December this year. And that is a significant share. That's with regards to the IHM development. What we see now is for those ships which have received the IHM and where the IHM has been certified, the next step is the IHM maintenance. So on the next slide, there are some fundamental aspects which need to be considered. The guidance provided by Hong Kong Convention, IHM guidelines, and also EU SRR is quite clear that the IHM maintenance has to be done on hand-off documents from suppliers. Our experience is that many suppliers are not prepared to provide these documents, which means the owners are struggling heavily to maintain the IHM in line with the legal requirements. But it's the owner's responsibility, and he can also ask for a service supply, because this is an issue which is quite far away from the daily operation of ships. It has a completely different scope. So when we look into the different scopes for the IHM maintenance, which is shown on the next slide, there are different approaches. Some of them are illegal or heavily ineffective. So there are services offered which combine inspection and sampling of ships and collection of some documents. Inspection and sampling is illegal for the IHM maintenance. Others require from the owner to collect the documents from the suppliers. This is, from my point of view, highly ineffective because there are a lot of exemptions for the scope of the IHM Part 1 and IHM Part 1 maintenance. And the owner needs to spend a lot of time for going through all the purchase orders to select the relevant ones only. Then we have the approach to request documents from all suppliers, and stories are circulating like a material declaration and suppliers declaration of conformity was requested for a box of banana. So this is definitely not the purpose of IHM maintenance. Then there are software tools around without any further support, which means the knowledge and training has to be provided to the persons which are using this software. It's slightly lowering the efforts or the time which is required, but I also don't believe that this is really an efficient approach. And there's another approach where experts which know about all the exemptions are selecting relevant purchase orders only, supported by a software tool. And what we have to consider is also that it's not only maintaining the IHM, it's also development of an IHM maintenance report, and these will be subject to port state control inspections, maybe from the beginning of next year onwards in European ports. So my conclusion on the next slide says, so the IHM development is not finished yet. we will see a lot of activity probably next year as well, because so far more than 50% of the affected ships will remain incompliant at the end of this year. The IHM maintenance has to follow the new ship approach, so it has to be based on SDOC and MD from suppliers. Suppliers are widely unprepared, and it creates continuous costs and efforts throughout the operational life of a ship. And we also have severe penalties from 2 EU states, which really put a lot of pressure on the owners to make sure that they are compliant. Finally, the EU ship recycling regulation is in force since nearly 7 years, and seeing the level of compliance to be on such a low level, it means really all hands on deck to achieve as much as possible in the time remaining, however long that time might be. So, thank you very much.
Sorry. So thank you, Henning. Now I would like to give the microphone to Robin, who'll give us an update on the capacity of EU approved ship recycling yards.
So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. My microphone is unmuted, I believe. Well, welcome to the webinar. As you might have seen, my company Marpoff did a study for BIMCO last year. We're updating it this year, so I'm just going to go over a few of the main items that come out of any in-depth study of the EU list. So next slide, please. So who is on the EU list and what does it mean? Now, as we all know, all European ships going for recycling must use an EU list yard. Now, it's been clear from the day one, from this was first mentioned, that the capacity provided just by the member states wasn't enough, and therefore they had to have third-party states. And in essence, from day one, it's been clear that Turkey and the US has been very helpful in this. But at first, only 1 or 2 Turkish yards were on the list. But now the latest list is up to about 8 yards, which is a much better number. We'll come into that. Furthermore, as Christian said at the start, we found out that some of the yards weren't even ready. Some didn't actually exist. One had gone bankrupt. The list is now being rationalised in the latest round of discussion. And indeed, all the UK yards will be removed from the list according to the draft information available at the moment at the start of next year. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the final subject as well, which is the fact that there remains no beaching yards on the list. Next slide, please. So just briefly, that's one of the best ship recycling yards, we think. That's Able UK, as you can see from the picture. Very big capacity and also offshore units. So the UK had 4 yards on the list. It had a huge claimed theoretical capacity, which was almost half the total of all the EU member states. But in terms of actual achievement, as listed on the IMO website, it was only actually working for ships at 3% of that theoretical capacity. Again, you can see in that photo, there's offshore units there, but no ships, because the most active yards probably exclusively offshore, and there's good financial reasons for that. So actually, although in theory, Brexit will reduce the numbers on the EU list massively, there won't be a huge capacity change in reality. Next slide, please. So here's the interesting bit, is that to date, there are no beaching yards on the European list. This is despite, at the latest information, at least 20 yards from India have applied. If you look very carefully on the list, you can find reasons for them not being in the list. Some of the information is redacted. Some of it you have to kind of read between the lines. But in general, it's because there's no control on the intertidal zone. Although some yards have put concrete in place, it may be that isn't necessarily helping. It actually hinders a yard being driven up on the beach, possibly. And again, maybe the auditors thought there was insufficient control of cutting impermeable surfaces and things. And of course, with all the big updates and the upgrades that some of the Indian yards have made to try to be on the European list, it's unclear how we're actually going to solve this riddle. And I think Henning had something to add here from his experience. Henning, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. Just to step in quickly, the key aspects which I see from the audit reports at the moment are more or less related to the hinterland infrastructure and less to the yards themselves, because they have proven that they can handle ships in line with the EU requirements. There are some bits and pieces which are still not closed. But at the moment, the key aspect, for instance, is that the local hospital in Alang is not acceptable for the EU auditors, which in itself have clear track record of being extremely critical with regards to beaching yards and very open-minded to the other yards. So just as a comment from the side.
Yes, thanks, Henning. And so, I mean, well, the last point on that slide is, you know, the Indian yards do want to be on the list, and they do need our help. Yes, the local hospital is a sticking point for some reason. I suspect that when the local hospital problem is solved, we will find some more sticking points. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting picture. This is taken from a video on the web, on Facebook actually, from a couple of days ago, and that shows Aliaga at the moment. Now again, COVID has caused a huge spike in the number of cruise ships certainly to be scrapped. So even with 8 yards on the list, you can see from that photo that possibly Aliaga for EU flagships is already full. I know from newspaper reports that there are already cruise ships queuing in ports which are slated to go to Aliaga and are waiting for slots. So there's the next question. Although we have a good number of Turkish yards now on the list, is it going to be enough? So my final slide is next, very brief overview. The big question, is the EU list fit for purpose? And the hypothesis we would put forward is that yes, there are some very good yards in Europe, both in the member states and in Turkey and America. But are there sufficient yards that actually do Panamax scrapping? So yes, if you're an existing customer, yes, if you're a local customer, as we've seen, a lot of them are doing offshore yards. If you're an EU flag, there are yards available for you. They may be filling up rapidly. And indeed, if you're a one-off project, it's amazing that some of the repair yards are helping out in this strange market. And of course, the money is still very different in EU list yards. But we would posit that the EU list is not fit for purpose if you've got a large number of Panamaxes to scrap, for example, if you want the best price, and indeed if you're not an EU ship flag. But then if you're not an EU ship flag, you don't have to use the EU list. But at the end of the day, the EU list is really intended, I imagine, to provide Hong Kong compliant tonnage in the long term. So will it be fit for the mass market of international shipping? Well, we wait and see. And on that note, I shall mute myself and hand over to Aaron, I imagine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. We'll move on to Aaron, who will briefly elaborate on how EU ship recycling affects international shipping, and not only EU flag ships. And that's before we move on to a panel discussion.
Thank you, Christian. At least I'll try to do so. Next slide, please. So from Robin, we heard a bit about the cruise industry, which has been hit hard by COVID-19, and they seem to be preferring the yards in Turkey. But what about tank, bulk, and containers? The slide here shows the last 24 months of global recycling activity in these sectors. And basically, without going into too much detail, recycling follows the conditions of the market. So what about the future? Well, we have a global recession that is combined with poor outlook for the major shipping markets. So this situation results in low freight rates. So BIMCO expects that this will push owners to get rid of the older and substandard tonnage, and plenty of recycling activity can be expected in the future. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, Just the next one. Oh, that's strange. Oh, here we go. Oh well, yeah. Sorry, my screen was frozen. Go on back, please. Yeah, and then the next one. Thank you. That's better. So in May 2020, we asked our owner members who were in the process of completing their IHM and obtaining the necessary documentation prior to compliance deadline of 31st of December 2020. The numbers were very similar to the ones Henning was showing you. 24% of the respondents, they said they had completed the process, while the rest, they were at various stages of compliance. But interestingly, everybody said that the IHM process had been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So based on this, we, together with other major shipping organizations, we sent a letter to the EU Commission to explain the challenges with the COVID pandemic, as earlier also alluded to by Henning. We received a reply in July, and basically they told us that the regulation will enter into force 1st of January 2021. But it was acknowledged that there could be circumstances that could be considered to be force majeure. And I'll make a quote from that letter. But member states will be invited to carefully assess the specific circumstances of each ship owner, that is this force majeure thing, to the degree to which this case law might apply. In their assessment, member states will be also invited to take due account of the length of the period between the entry into force of the ship recycling regulation and the application date of the IHM deadline, and consider to what extent that period was used by the particular ship owner to prepare and complying with those obligations, unquote. So each ship owner will be assessed based on what they've done. And secondly, the EU member states will look into the force majeure and see what can be considered based on that. And the discussion will be coordinated with port state control when they reach a decision. And we know that the EU Maritime Directors still have a meeting here on the 6th and 7th October to discuss just those things. Next slide, please. So, what now? Well, we hope that that the EC and the EU member state will consider an enforcement grace period to enable ship owners to catch up with the lost time caused by COVID-19. And in the meantime, we recommend that ship owners should prepare documentation of what they have done to comply. And if you cannot meet the deadline for all ships, we recommend you to start with the oldest ones first to be in line with the spirit of the new regulation. If you have ships that need to be recycled in this period, then we have provided some guidelines together with ICS and others. So you can use those, and also we of course would like you to use the the BIMCO standard contracts, which covers the Hong Kong Convention and then basically most also of the EU regulation. We would need, of course, recycling states to ratify the Hong Kong Convention. Turkey and India have done so already, and we have reason to believe that China will start a hearing process soon as part of their ratification process. So there might be some end at the light of the tunnel. That's it from me. Thank you, Christian.
And thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you, Henning, Aaron, and Robin, for your excellent presentations. So I'll move on to some questions, and please, participants, feel free to put in any relevant questions to the chat box. Henning, you raised your hand.
Yes, just on the very last part of Aaron's presentation with regards to entry into force of Hong Kong Convention, there is a domestic legislation in Bangladesh which requires from the Bangladeshi government to ratify the Hong Kong Convention latest in February 2023. So irrespective of whether or not their yards are compliant with Hong Kong Convention. So then a major ship recycling country will probably also ratify Hong Kong Convention, which makes the entry into force of it much more likely.
That's a very interesting information. So, but in the current situation, and maybe Henning, you also, I'll ask you the first question here. I know that the IHM for a ship is not developed overnight. It's normally a very time and resource demanding process. However, if a ship owner succeeds in getting an IHM surveyor on board the ship despite COVID-19, is there any way that the process can be speeded up? And what can the ship owner do to help smoothing the process?
Yeah. First of all, I think the ship owner can't do much except of arranging a smooth access to the ship, and best would be that the ships are operating in ports which can conveniently be reached by the IHM experts, and there are some differences as well. The onboard activity doesn't take long. I would say one long working day for most of the ships is enough, maybe 1.5 days. But then the samples go to a laboratory, and the properly accredited laboratories are extremely busy already with the other IHM activities. Then the report is finished. So with regards to the lab, we easily talk about 3 weeks, sometimes even 2 months until we get the results. So once the report is finished, it has to be provided to the class, which has to review it as well and carry out an initial inspection. Again, the ship has to be at a convenient port where access can be granted. And then the certification process can be continued with, which also takes some time. So anyone who is now looking into getting the IHMs prepared must have perfect conditions to really meet the deadlines. Anybody else will be one of the late runners.
Robin, what's your experience on this?
Yes, thank you. I mean, yes, I mean, I think we tend to get slightly faster turnaround from the laboratories than that. We can get 5 days out of the labs if we're lucky. But I think the more important point, which Henning hasn't really mentioned, is the capacity of the IHM expert companies. There are very few IHM companies out there in the world, really. Some are larger than others, and it's simply there's a big queue forming, and a lot of the IHM companies are working at capacity already. So it's a question of having the availability of experts, which people like Henning and myself have been saying for a couple of years now, and COVID has just made that 10 times worse, really. So you've got to be in the queue already.
So taking into consideration the information from you two right now, and also what Henning mentioned in his presentation, that the survey done shows that almost 20,000 ships will be in non-compliance at New Year, and taking into consideration also the COVID-19 restrictions. Do you have any estimate of when realistically all ships calling EU ports will be in compliance with the IHM requirement? And maybe Robin, you will start.
Yes, I mean the companies that we work with, I think it's probably fair to say that if you've already got a contract with the people that we know, they will do everything they can to have your ship compliant by Christmas. And I think that, if you're already in the system, I think you can be, COVID, God willing, confident that the companies will do everything for existing companies. But they can't give that assurance to people who are knocking on the door at the moment. So I think there's going to be a very large proportion of ships which are not compliant in January. If we say 56% are not compliant at the moment, then I don't think we're ever going to get below 30% or something like that. There simply isn't the time and the capacity in the market. But those are guess figures, but I think they're ballpark correct. And then it's down to the EU member states individually how they're going to act in terms of port state control. And I think that as BIMCO, as Aaron has said, is that certainly we will provide a paper trail to companies who can't get compliant to show all the actions that they've done, and then hope that the port state control and the member states will be sensible, pragmatic, and flexible towards them. But at the same time, the good owners who have gone to all these efforts and done all this work, why should they not have an advantage for the work that they've done? There is that side of the coin as well, of course.
Henning, do you think so? You also mentioned a possible postponement from the EU. Do you think 12 months, for instance, have been mentioned on the internet? Do you think that would be enough to make sure that all ships calling EU are able to be in compliant? I know it's a guess, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we don't know how the future for travel restrictions will continue. But I guess.
Yeah, I think 12 months is what we need at least. I don't want to ask too much from the EU because I think it's a difficult decision anyway, as these requirements are known since nearly 7 years. So, of course, force majeure is an issue, but seeing how many ships have not signed a contract for getting the IHMs developed, as Robin said, those guys which have started early should be in or get an advantage out of that, and those which have not done anything, they might face some punishment, independent of whether or not the deadline will be postponed. 6 months, from my point of view, I guess will not be enough, because the sheer number of ships which need to be processed is simply too high. And yeah, there are ups and downs. For instance, 10 days ago, we got a contract for 4 ships. They were all inspected. In the meantime, the samples are now with the laboratory, so they will make it. But it really depends on where are the IHM experts and are they available when the ship is in the port. So we have more than 50 IHM experts worldwide, but traveling is extremely difficult, even we are have a good distributed network.
And Aaron, I see you have raised your hand. And
thank you. Yeah, and I can say that 12 months is actually also what we are trying to persuade the European Commission to give us some kind of grace period of that magnitude. I also have to defend our members a little bit, because I don't know if everybody is familiar with Pareto's law, but Pareto's law says something about that 80% of the work will be done in the last 20% of the time, and it even goes to 90 and 10%. So it's a common thing to postpone things to the last minute. So it's not only ship owners. Thank you.
Yeah, and Aaron, now where I have you, and we've received our first question here from the participants, and I'll read it out loud. So, what is BIMCO doing to ensure that BIMCO's members are engaging with companies that want to establish yards in line with EU standards?
Well, I have to say we do not know a lot about the individual yards, but experts like Henning and Robin, they have much more feeling with the various yards at the different places around the world, and so what we can do then is that when somebody calls in and asks about a specific yard, we can try to give some advice based on the knowledge we have. But we don't have sort of a list of a white list and a black list and things like that. That would simply be too hard to do. Thank you.
And Robin, I see you would like to comment on this.
Yes, I think I think that everyone's doing a lot of work over the years, especially BIMCO, ICS, to encourage the yards to improve, and the yards have done a lot of work. Now, we're not going to publish individual yards, but I think everyone knows that there's maybe, should we say, 4 or 5 top yards in India, and it would really help if though one of those yards at least could actually get on the list to show what the auditors actually do want, or at least, you know, we had concrete things about what that one yard does, because there are yards in India which are head and shoulders above, should we say, the worst yards. There are yards that very famous, well-known owners are using presently and getting good results, we believe, from our experience. So we need those handful of good yards to make really positive steps in engagement and communication with the EU list, because Hong Kong compliance must be the same level as EU. We can't have different systems of yards. There must be parity in the long term.
Henning, what's your view on this and first movers and how to incentivize yards and?
Yeah, I work with a big number of these yards which have implemented Hong Kong Convention, also the EU ship recycling regulation requirements. What I witnessed is that it's a highly political issue. It's not about technicalities and the implemented standards to a wide range. So of course it always depends on the individual yard, but there are top-notch yards which are applying the beaching method as well, which per se is not a bad method. It depends on how it is conducted, with lots of tiny bits and pieces which need to be considered properly. So I'm always wondering who the EU auditors are, because they have a proven track record to be against beaching and questioning in public since a long time if beaching method can be compliant with Hong Kong Convention. And as we know, EU SRR is more stringent than HKC. They are top-notch yards, as I said, and the issue is ship owners also need to figure out what are their requirements, what's their approach to recycling, and this is in many cases out of their scope. And if they try to evaluate or apply due diligence to the selection of the proper recycler, they start from scratch. So they should really look into it or ask somebody who can guide them properly and not misguide them. There are also some guys around which propose a lot of things, and then the ship ends up under the ownership of a letterbox on a small, beautiful island. These are all issues which should not be followed up on when an owner decides on who to sell the ship to. So there are a few indicators, but there are people around also like Robin and us and others who can really provide proper and fair and transparent guidance.
Thank you, Henning. And Aaron, I see you also indicated that you would like to say something on this on the behavior.
Yeah, going back to our standard contract recycling con, if you want to be really sure that the yard that you engage with is up to speed and is in compliance with the Hong Kong Convention and the EU regulation, the only thing you can do is to go out there, visit the yard and make sure yourself. That's the best method. It costs money, I know, but that's simply the best method. Thank you.
Jens, I think we should also touch upon the IHM maintenance and port state control, move on a little bit. So Henning, I would like to ask you, sometimes ship buy spare parts urgently locally in foreign ports, sometimes far away from the normal suppliers. And I guess the item related documentation and declarations provided may vary in quality. How should ship owners in the future manage spare parts not supplied directly from the manufacturer of the machinery or the equipment?
Yeah, first of all, I really like saying, the quality material declarations. This is an issue which needs to be discussed in future. properly and the penalties associated with incorrect data coming from suppliers. In most cases, spare parts are supplied by suppliers and not by manufacturers. So it always depends on what items we are talking about. And what we see also is that many maritime suppliers are heavily unprepared and not aware of these requirements as a follow-up because many ship owners are not applying the proper IHM maintenance concept at all. So the key issue is transparency in the documentation of the hazardous materials on board. And if an urgent supply is provided by, let's say, non-prepared or non-maritime supplier from a local market anywhere on the globe, this should be properly documented as well with, let's say, a question mark, or let's say some sort of a, what we call for existing ships, PCHM, potentially containing hazardous materials, so that later on everybody knows that there's a spare part which has been installed with unspecified characteristics. So it's all about transparency and awareness also when the ship is sent for to the recycler, that he knows that nobody knows what exactly is contained in the spare part and that he has to apply his follow-up activities, which need to be described in the ship recycling facility plan anyway. So they must be prepared for those, let's say, gaps in the documentation.
I know we've talked about IHM maintenance before, and that it is a huge task. And Aaron, I see you also would like to chip in on this one.
It's just to say that this is really one of the reasons why we need the Hong Kong Convention to enter into force, because if you have an EU regulation demanding IHMs and you have a lot of the suppliers being outside the EU, they are not inside that regulation. So we need international regulations so that it can be common practice all over the globe. That's just my comment. Thank you.
The European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, has published best practice on how to develop an IHM. Is there any industry best practice for ship owners specifically focusing on how to best do the IHM maintenance? Has such a standard been developed yet, and would it make sense to develop such best practice? Robin, I saw your hand before, or should I let it go to Henning? I'll let it go to.
Yeah, no, I was going to highlight some of the dangers of compiling of the maintenance. I mean, Henning's right that if you really don't know what something is, presumed containing is the last resort. But it really causes more problems for us than anything else. PCHM, it's an absolute nightmare. But yes, I mean, as I said, we have so many issues in the supply chain. I don't think ship owners really understand that only 60 countries in the world have banned asbestos. And even the US can manufacture things from asbestos and they don't have to declare it on the product. So although we have this system whereby we're meant to have manufacturers' declarations, the supply chain, as Aaron says, is just not mature enough to present those parts with the documentation needed. Now we saw the agony that the car industry went through to produce this, and in Europe we have REACH. So it has been done, and it's been done to much higher standards in other industries. So we must catch up. That's all there is to it, because for the ship owner, presumed containing hazardous materials is a disaster in the long term. You need to know what's in it. You need to force your supply chain, and you need to be tough on them. I'm afraid. I know that's coming from me. I'm not a ship owner, but it's in everyone's interest to really drag the supply chain into the 21st century.
So what I also hear you say, Robin, is that you actually also need to regulate other entities than the ship itself. Henning, you raised your hand.
Yeah, in line with what Robin just said, the PCHM is, of course, the last resort we can use, because if I'm documenting for a ship that I have no clue what kind of hazardous materials, if any, are contained in a specific type of equipment or material, as an owner, I have to take care of the well-being, health and safety issues of my crew. So it has an operational impact, which can be quite severe. And it has an impact on the asset value on the ship. So I would really love to see an industry best practice on IHM maintenance. What I see at the moment are so many misleading approaches which come, let's say, at a very cheap service fee, but in the end, it requires lots of involvement from the owners who don't have the right knowledge about material compliance, data exchange in supply chains, and not only chain of information, but also chain of liability, which in the end is extremely costly and inefficient. So bringing it down to the right scope and reducing it only to the necessary scope and knowing properly how to follow up is essential. And that would really safeguard the owners and make it easier for them to agree to implement a functioning IHM maintenance process. At the moment, everybody is running around and does not really understand what is this all about. And it's basically a very unattractive issue for shipping in general. Nobody wants to know about the hazardous materials because it's negative information. And when you apply a certain level of quality to these aspects, not so many are interested in it unless they understand the consequences of a poorly maintained IHM or poor IHM to start with.
And Robin, I see your hand.
Yes, just I mean, there's all sorts of things we need to consider. We get a lot of questions about, you know, what is a major upgrade when you have to bring the RO back in to verify it. I think what the point I wanted to add is that, you know, we have an industry working group formed of ICS, BIMCO, and people like that. Maybe this is something that the industry working group should think to put together, because we need something that is in more detail and more practical than the EMSA guidance, because the EMSA guidance is not focused on maintenance. And that is the next big issue, which we do need industry-driven solutions for, not regulatory-driven solutions. We have the regulations. We need the industry to tell us what to do, and we need to take part of that ourselves, probably through the industry working group or something, but quickly, you know.
So, Aaron, I see your hand.
Thank you. I'll be very short. I totally agree with Robin. Let's try and see if we can do something. I think also, yeah, you jumped Henning in front of me, but
oh, sorry.
So sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just as Robin made a reference to the EMSA best practice, basically we need to consider that EMSA best practice is a collection of lots of best and good practices. But if it would be applied in full, as it is required by one of the EU member states, probably due to lack of understanding, we would eradicate, I would say, 90% of the existing IHM expert capacity, because hardly anybody is capable of acting fully in line with this collection of best practices. That would even worsen things. But it's a nice guidance document, but it's clearly saying also it should not be used for the certification of initial IHMs, and that's what it's focusing on.
Jens, I see we're too fast coming to the end of our webinar, but before we end, I would also like to talk a little bit about port state control. So Aaron mentioned the Maritime Directors meeting coming up, but have we any indication so far at this stage on an harmonized approach on postponement or relaxed enforcement of the deadline from any of the EU member states? Aaron, maybe you could start.
I think so. We are still waiting on the final reaction from the EC. So the industry group that Robin talked about, we were the ones to send a letter. I know that others have also sent letters to the European Commission. So basically, we are waiting on their reply. And I haven't heard about anything so far, because simply it hasn't entered into force yet. So we are just trying to prevent a catastrophe for the ships calling at Europe from 1st of January. Thank you.
And Robin, your hand is raised.
Yes, just to echo what Henning just said, but bring it under port state control. About 18 months ago, we gave a training session in Portugal to EMSA with a lot of the port state control people there. And the answer from everyone in the port state control as to what standards they were going to apply was the best practice. Now, as Henning says, it is best practice. It says it in the thing. It is voluntary. It is not to be used for regulation. It is not fit for purpose with PSC. It says that itself. And yet all the PSC people have said, oh, we have this guidance, we'll follow that, because they don't have the experts in this field. And there's a lack of knowledge across the entire industry. And you can't rely on documents that aren't designed for that use. So there's a very big danger. It's not just will it be enforced, it's how will it be enforced. And if the individual member states think they're going to use a voluntary best practice guideline to arrest ships, that is the wrong approach. And we need industry guidance to get the right approach back.
And Henning, I see you also want to comment on what Robin just said.
Yeah, it's really a frightening situation. At the moment, we are lacking any experience because none of such PSC inspections have taken place. But on the contrary, seeing what some classification societies are offering as guidance, which basically sometimes ends up in a normal Excel file to be shown to PSC, and comparing to what Robin just has said, this is so far away from each other. It's really frightening and creating a lot of also unnecessary risks for owners to get into trouble with PSCs. I tried here to figure out what the PSC will look for during the PSC inspections. There was not a single useful answer which I have received. So let's see. I hope under Paris MOU proper guidance will be provided, and which will not focus on the EMSA best practice guidance, because that would definitely be a disaster and from a legal point of view, not the right approach at all.
And as far as I've understood, like with other issues such as the sulfur regulation, the penalties are determined by the individual member state country, right? And Henning, did you have some information on what the maximum penalties for non-compliance with the IHM requirement could be in the various EU countries? Because that could be worrying.
Yes, well, not all EU member states have defined these penalties yet. Even Germany is put to the European Court because of lack of implementing the EU SRR. What I'm aware of is, for instance, France says it can cost up to 100,000 euros and 1 year imprisonment for non-appropriate IHMs, which means either the initial IHM has been prepared but is lacking to fulfill the requirements, whether or not it's EMSA best practice guidance or whatever is on the sideline, or it's not certified, or it is not properly maintained. In UK, the penalty is a financial one, which is not further specified or limited, and up to 2 years imprisonment. So this is really severe, even though I'm not aware of who might go to prison. Is it the owner? Is it the chief engineer, the master, whoever? But the penalties are really, really severe.
Yeah, Robin, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, I mean, I think we've got to remember that there's not just the immediate financial penalties Henning's mentioned. I don't think people will go to jail. I think there may be financial penalties, but by far and away the biggest penalty will be the delay on the ship, the arresting the ship, and the denial of entry potentially into the next port. Those are other things to consider. Outside the immediate penalties just for non-compliance, it's, can you come into Europe? Can you go to the next port? How long is it going to be before port state control release you? How do they release you? Those are, soft penalties which have a much bigger impact on the immediate ability to move cargo.
Yeah. Yeah, there are certainly huge consequences here. And Henning, your hand is raised. Was that from before? Or, so, gents, we've gone 10 minutes above our schedule, and I don't have any more questions from the audience. So I would like to finish off with coming back to the EU list of approved shipyards and ask you, what will happen with the EU list when the Hong Kong Convention comes into force? Robin, do you have a view on this?
Well, as I said earlier, and again, although Henning did point out that there are little additional requirements for an EU list yard as opposed to a Hong Kong yard, but I think we need to harmonise the both. We can't have this multi-layer system. If there are slight elements in the EU requirements, SRR, which are required, so that you're both, you know, we don't. I mean, I hope that when the Hong Kong Convention comes into force, the EU SRR sees itself as unnecessary. It was always the intent to help compliance with Hong Kong, and therefore when Hong Kong comes into force, I hope that EU SRR will appreciate that and say they're now overwritten by the good implementation of Hong Kong. But I must say I don't think that's going to happen immediately, and I think I don't have a lot of faith in that. That's my hope.
Yeah, thank you. And Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. We in BIMCO, we always would prefer to have one global regulation on things. But like Robin, I'm a little bit skeptical that the EU list will go away. It seems much easier for bureaucrats to come up with new regulation than to remove them again. So I hope that it will disappear when the Hong Kong Convention comes into force, but I'm skeptical. Thank you.
And Henning, last intervention from you.
Yeah, thank you. Fully in line with what Aaron and Robin said. Also, what we have to see the efficiency of the EU SRR with regards to the EU list and extending it. So we have the Basel Ban Amendment, which has really opened up the box of Pandora, which was really well known to the guys who developed the EU SRR. But they were simply hoping that it will not enter into force at such an early point of time. So now, from a legal point of view, it is nearly impossible for the EU to put any of the yards located in non-OECD countries on the list. So it is a legal issue. And as Aaron said, it seems much easier to come up with new regulations than taking existing legislations out and to rely on international conventions. Probably they fear loss of control, but I would definitely prefer to have Hong Kong Convention instead of any, no matter which continent, any regional approaches.
Thank you, gents. And I noticed Henning's statement in the beginning saying all hands on deck. And it sounds like from your presentation and interventions that it's all hands on deck, but not only from the industry, but also from other stakeholders in this. So now it's been 1 hour and I don't have any further questions. So I'll thank you very much to all three of you for an excellent webinar. And thank you to the audience for the questions. And I wish you all a good day and a good afternoon and a good evening.